Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this FPRI special event of People, Politics, and Prose, our monthly program on discussions with authors about their work, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri, Templeton Education Fellow at FPRI and the director of our Center for the Study of America in the West. I'll be your host for today's discussion, and I'm also here in place of our president, Dr. Raleigh Flynn, who is unable to join us today, but wanted me to send her welcome on behalf of FPRI. And before we get started with this discussion, I wanted to say that FPRI is pleased to offer programs like this one regularly to enlighten, to inform, and to entertain. And if you are joining us for the first time or the fifth time or the 50th time, we hope that you will consider making an offering of some sort or a donation to support the work of FPRI, to become a partner, to become a member, in order to help us to produce more programs like this one. Please check out our website, fpri.org, for information on how you can also help to support FPRI as a partner or a member. With that in mind, we will move to today's program. I want to say generally, as a housekeeping advice, that we will be opening the discussion to the participants, to all of you, to use the Q&A function of the webinar in order to post your questions, and we will then read them. I will read them and we will engage with them. If you have technical problems, use the chat function to send a message to the Foreign Policy Research Institute. But with all that having been said, welcome today to our discussion on People, Politics, and Prose. In July 1898, the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, John Hay, famously told his friend Theodore Roosevelt that the recent victory over Spain had been a, quote, splendid little war. In the century plus since then, the United States has fought a wide range of little wars, though few of them have been splendid. The number of small-scale engagements, often defending embattled friendly regimes, grew throughout the Cold War. Some, such as Vietnam, grew into larger conflicts. Others stayed within limits, though were no less deadly for those involved. The global war on terror has increased the range of such conflicts in time and space, from secret wars in the Philippines and West Africa to more well-known struggles against ISIS, or, until recently, the Taliban. For Americans, such fights have been the source of human and political trauma. For adversaries, such as the Russians and Ukraine, small-scale engagements offer opportunities to expand influence at relatively low cost, leaving others to decide how to respond. In either case, learning more about the history and possibilities of such small engagements is vital for a United States that needs to get smarter about how, when, and where to expend its resources. Michael Noonan offers a primer on irregular conflict in his new book, Irregular Soldiers and Rebellious States, a historical survey and policy analysis that discusses the benefits as well as the costs of those actions. As he concludes, paraphrasing Hay's good friend TR, in the end, the U.S. arsenal of big stick military tools must also be complemented through the maintenance of a smaller and more nimble stick that is both sharp and smart, close quote. So what has been the American experience with irregular warfare? What lessons can or should we learn from those experiences? And how can preparing for such conflict help avoid bigger trouble in the future? Those questions and yours will guide us in conversation with our guest, Dr. Michael P. Noonan. Dr. Michael Noonan is a senior fellow in FPRI's National Security Program. A former captain in the U.S. Army Reserve, in 2006-2007, he served on a military transition team with an Iraqi light infantry battalion in and around the northern city of Tal Afar. Holder of a PhD in political science from Loyola University Chicago, as well as degrees from the University of Scranton and Creighton University, Dr. Noonan has taught at Loyola University Chicago, Haverford College, and Swarthmore College. His writings have appeared in outlets such as The American Interest, Orbis, Parameters, and War on the Rocks. Welcome to People, Politics, and Prose, Dr. Michael Noonan.
Thanks, Ron.
It's great to have you here, Mike. And I also I forgot to add. Usually, the introducer says this about me, is that although I am indeed among other things, a professor of history at the U.S. Army War College, my comments today should be interpreted as only my own. They are not the opinions of the U.S. Army War College, the United States Army, or the Department of Defense. And I think the same can be said for retired Captain Noonan. So, Mike, tell us about how this book came to be. What's the genesis of it?
So the genesis of this book comes from basically since the Gulf War. I've been very interested in sort of, after the Persian Gulf War, we entered this period of unipolarity or Pax Americana kind of moment. And the interesting thing about it was that after the Gulf War, somebody asked the chief of staff of the Indian Army, what's the lesson of the Gulf War? And he said the lesson is don't confront the United States without nuclear weapons. I think nuclear weapons really, for great powers or middle powers and above, really constrained sort of the large-scale use of force. And it pushed a lot of things, after the fall of the Soviet Union. We saw this spread of kind of internecine conflicts, all of these conflicts across the periphery, where the Soviets and the United States have really been fighting the Cold War. On the Fulda Gap and other places, we had these big standoffs between large conventional forces. But we also had these messier political military conflicts across the periphery. So that kind of had my interest basically through graduate school. And then 9/11 happens, and in 2006, I was sitting at FPRI, and I got a call saying, you've been mobilized, you're going to Iraq, you're going to work on a military transition team, basically an 11-person advisory unit to work with the Iraqi army. So then I went to Fort Hood, Texas, and got like 6 weeks of individual training. I got another 2 weeks of training in Kuwait and Iraq. And then, basically, 2 months after I, was sitting at my desk at a think tank, I'm, in, Nineveh province, where Jonah was going before the whale took him off his journey. And then working with the Iraqi army on the ground without a lot of training, without a lot of resources. And that kind of experience really got me interested in these broader questions. Now, at the same time, I was doing my dissertation. I had, taken leaves of absence for my dissertation. And by the time I got back from Iraq, I said, I'm really not interested in my original topic, which is not something I would recommend doing. So basically, I reconceived my dissertation. I did it on civil military relations and small scale advisory units. So that's another part of the book where parts of it come from. But just kind of an interest in this, and then finally, after that, and then moving forward into we go from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, and around 2014 we see kind of the revenge of geopolitics, to borrow the late great Harvey Sickerman's title, and also Bob Kaplan's book title, where we had been fighting Al Qaeda and these other wars, and then China and Russia are kind of expanding. Russia starting in 2006 or 2008 in Georgia, and then 2014 the invasion of Crimea. The Chinese at the same time are starting to saber rattle in the East China Sea. They're starting to literally construct sovereignty in the South China Sea. So there's kind of all these things are popping up, and there's a kind of a new era of great power competition, which was kind of a term that came up in kind of the later Obama years, and during the Trump era. I think we're moving away from that, but I think the kernel of that is still there. That that there are the United States is still a global power. We still have interests globally. Our economy is very dependent on international trade. I think in Pennsylvania alone, about 20% of the state's GDP is dependent on international trade. And jobs here are dependent on that trade. So we're going to remain engaged. The problem is, how are we going to do that? And, due to things like nuclear weapons, I think people in the 20 teens were really looking for a way to get away from Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think part of the problem is that our kind of lack of performance there. I'm not talking tactically. I think tactically we did very well in places, but operationally and strategically with these kinds of issues, I think will embolden states like China and Russia to kind of, if your enemy is not doing something well, I think like Mike Horowitz said, speaking about Al Qaeda, if we had mastered kind of the Bosnias and Kosovos and Hades of the 1990s, then Al Qaeda might have come at us very differently.
Right.
But you see sort of these political military things where we haven't really shown an ability to learn, because I'm sure you'll ask about this some more. But the U.S. military, for the most part, really sees COIN or counterinsurgency and these other things as kind of lesser included tasks. Something that a military can do, but we've shown time and time again that that's not really the case. It's not just something that you can add an annex to an operations order and just expect people to go from driving on Baghdad to worrying about municipal services in Mosul or the Baghdad suburbs.
And that's good, because this is why I want to press on this particular point to get us into the discussion as well. Is that I may be misinterpreting this, but when I listen to political leaders and even military leaders talk about how the desire is to move towards an understanding of great power competition, that suggests to me that those leaders really want to believe that by focusing on near peer great power competition, that we can get away from having to do all this small scale, messy, complicated stuff. And yet, if I read your book correctly, and if I heard you correctly just now, you're saying that rivalry or those competitions with other great powers will include this small scale conflict as well as large scale conflict. And why do you think people don't seem to understand that? Why is it that people want to make that distinction between great power competition and smaller conflicts?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is just kind of broader military culture. I think the services have kind of dominant professional considerations for what they think are, purely military considerations. And I think that gets us into trouble where we start doing sort of conventional net assessment, where we say, oh, the Chinese have X number of fighter wings and X number of bombers and X number of this class of surface combatant, et cetera, or this many armored divisions, whereas I think that both Russia and China, they really learned from, the U.S. military really did there were some big revolutions in technology and the way that we fight. So if you look at the 1990-91, Persian Gulf War, we have, over 500,000 troops in the desert. And then that's not including our allies and partners that were there as well. And then in 2003, when we invade Iraq, we're doing that with 20% of that size force, and actually going further and deeper into Iraq. And I think both the Russians and the Chinese both kind of learned these lessons about how technology and forces you can make a smaller. You don't need kind of large standing armies. You can have smaller, more capital intensive militaries. That are just as kind of operationally capable. The problem is that once military operations stop and you start going into kind of civil military operations, then that's where boots on the ground kind of helps that. I think part of the problem, and our friend Frank Hoffman has kind of written about this, but in the Trump administration, when Secretary Mattis released his national national defense strategy, it was only the publicly available portion of that document was about 11 pages.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually, so you have the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, which the Defense Department, the civilian part of the Defense Department does, and then you have the national military strategy, which is kind of the uniformed services do under this kind of tripartite system. And the publicly available parts of this was so small that I think a lot of people, including our adversaries, unfortunately, got the misperception that great power competition equaled kind of returning to kind of big boy war, or, you know, we're preparing for large conventional operations. Now, those things are important. You know, during the Cold War, you know, if we don't have that conventional and nuclear deterrence, then the probability of a war between the US and the Soviet Union is greatly increased. But now I think it's kind of, you know, we've seen that nuclear deterrence works, and that's pushing things down to a lower scale. So I think countries that we've seen, you know, Russia and China are kind of doing things on the periphery, expanding their influence in different places, not just in the military sphere, but also informationally, economically, diplomatically, you know, the dime elements of power. So it's really holistic, and you know, that's part of the issue as well.
And if that's and so if we are if we need to realize that, you know, adding in great power competition doesn't mean we get to drop off the things that are hard to do, that they're all in there one place. What kind of I want to get into your historical examples about, you know, what this is all about, but we're on this policy question to start off. Is what kind of practical policies should the United States pursue if it wants to be prepared to fight sort of along this entire range of the as we say, the competition spectrum?
Yeah.
You know, what is it? What should we do? And do you think there are things that we haven't been doing yet?
Well, I wrote a piece for the Modern War Institute back in at West Point back in April, talking about some of these things. I think one of the issues is that we can't think of, you know, in the past, I think either, yeah, so you know, the military is a large bureaucracy. There are different interests there. You see the world in different ways, and you know, at the end of the day, money and resources kind of drive the train on a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we need to realize is that these kind of messy political military conflicts, you know, one, we have to realize that the other interagency partners have to, you know, the DoD always talks about, you know, other people have to show up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that also means that, you know, that a division of resources has to be kind of rebalanced a bit. I think the Biden administration has talked about this. We'll see what they do about it. It's I won't go into that example right now, but you know, we have to see that, you know, special operations forces are not the place where we can just kind of dump all these problems and say, okay, SOF will do this.
Right.
The conventional military has to be involved in this. The Army has done this a bit with these SFABs, the Security Force Assistance Brigades. There's 5 of them on active duty, and they're standing up one in the National Guard to kind of work with regional forces. Part of this issue is that, you know, Army Special Forces, which traditionally are kind of advisory units, have been so busy during the global war on terrorism that they weren't really available to kind of partner with forces. And that's kind of, the SFABs kind of grew out of the MIT that I was on, and other kind of advisory practices before that kind of big Army didn't want to do until they kind of got forced into it, and kind of resources push them to kind of develop these things.
Well, and of course that gets into an interesting question of, you know, you described your experience, how basically 2 months from you get a phone call in Philadelphia, hey Mike, you're being mobilized, and within 2 months you are essentially the primary representative of the United States of America in the villages that you may be walking into. What does it say about the United States sense of priorities about these kinds of low, ground level interactions, that they would put so much stress on reserve component on short training being sent to do this? And has that changed at all, do you think?
I think it's changed a bit in terms of, we were the last advisor teams that were this hybrid reserve and active duty teams. And then after us, First Infantry Division, one of their brigades, took over that mission. So they had started to transition that. We'll see what happens with the SFABs, whether they stick around or if they're just kind of placeholders, so that the Army didn't lose these brigade combat team flags. That will be kind of that'll be the sign after Afghanistan are these things sticking around or are they going away? And I think bureaucratically, they've probably done some things to increase their capabilities there, but you never know. I mean, the Army used to have a thing called the Asymmetric Warfare Group, which has gone away, which was kind of, it was collecting kind of best practices and doing other things to prepare the Army for irregular warfare missions. But even when I was doing that, a lot of that was that the reserve component wanted some relevancy, so they took that mission. The Army didn't want to do it. After the fact, Army officers were always like, "Well, you guys weren't the right guys to send," blah blah blah, and it's like, okay, like, point taken, but like, you had plenty of opportunities to volunteer for this and you didn't.
And you did not.
As I joked at the time, a career competitive active duty Army officer would have rather gotten a venereal disease than orders to go on a MIT team. I'm sorry if this is too blue at 3:22 in the afternoon, but
it does it raises this interesting question, actually, and this gets to something that I see. We have a few questions coming in, and there's a comment from Larry Holman who says, well, first of all, Jim Thompson wanted you to repeat. So you were talking about SFABs, right? So that's
yes. Security Force Assistance Brigades.
Security Force Assistant Brigades.
Yes.
But Larry Holman raises this point. He says a nation can only go to war if the entire nation is on a war footing, all in or all out. That certainly is not true as a factual statement. It might indeed be true as what should be a policy preference. But let's talk about historically the way that the United States has used small irregular conflicts as part of its security policy as ways to avoid engaging the entire the entire apparatus of American warfighting. And have we seen small wars as ways to avoid having to demand that kind of all in or all out commitment by the United States?
Everything basically pre 1898 is really kind of, if you look at the cases. So historically, about 73% instances of the use of the U.S. forces, U.S. armed forces abroad have been in these kind of irregular, quote unquote, irregular operations. Historically that's been the norm. They're kind of the regular, it's kind of this odd misnomer where you're talking about traditional or non-traditional or regular or irregular, where, the preponderance of cases have really been on kind of the low end of the spectrum. Now, pre-1898 and kind of global communications, et cetera, some of these things are just kind of piecemeal things, a U.S. ship goes into a harbor somewhere and, they don't render honors or something. So the captain takes offense and sends the Blue Jackets and Marines ashore for these kind of smaller scale engagements. But I think really, and one of the reasons I was kind of interested in this topic is that, so if you look at the Cold War, everybody's talking about kind of the big war, but the hottest parts of the Cold War are really along the periphery. So the places that are not on kind of page one of the New York Times is really kind of where the action is happening. Right. Now, some of this is, so Vietnam obviously has a big impact on this. Two interesting things about Vietnam, kind of the Vietnam experience. One, it really fundamentally changes. It has a long-lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy. even in places like El Salvador in the 1980s. I didn't include some of this in the book, but there are memorandums talking about, special forces soldiers aren't allowed to wear green berets. They're not, at one point they were debating whether they could carry M16s or if they were going to issue them Uzis, because they didn't want a New York Times reporter showing a guy in a green beret and an M16 or a Car 15, in the jungles of Latin America, because then automatically people would say, oh, this is how we got into Vietnam, through Laos and South Vietnam in the early 60s. So that really had kind of a powerful impact and break on policy. But these kind of smaller scale, our inability to kind of master these operations. I said before, tactically we've been very successful in certain places at certain times. But I think operationally and strategically, kind of our inability to master these types of operations are pushing our adversaries, whether they are, Taliban, in Eastern Afghanistan, or China or Russia, to kind of lower levels of response, because they're not, proxy war, I think is becoming, if you look at Iran, what they've done in Lebanon and Yemen with the Houthis there, in Syria, this is all kind of a forward defense strategy for them to deter both the Gulf states and Israel by causing problems, far away. So I think it's a viable, until somebody comes up with, and another problem is that all these types of operations are so sui generis that, it's not a one size fits all approach. This is the complaint with FM 3-24, the counterinsurgency manual. We're talking about population centric counterinsurgency, but it's not a one size fits all tool. That might work in certain circumstances, but not in others.
Well, and we get to the problem of irregular combat as when it's used in counterinsurgency to help prop up or support a friendly regime, right? That means you end up with U.S. forces fighting a small, complicated conflict on behalf of an ally, and there's a question floating around that I can draw out of some of the questions that have been posted here, and that is, when does it, how should the United States think strategically about a partner nation that is facing an insurgency and is incapable of dealing with that insurgency effectively on its own? Perhaps that should be a signal that the United States can't deal with that insurgency either, or shouldn't.
I mean, that's so let me just state up front. In the book, I talk about the beginning of Iraq in the north, which is kind of an economy of force operation in the north of the CIA and 10th Special Forces Group. And I also talk about the start of the Afghanistan war, which is kind of a small scale, unconventional warfare operation working with the Northern Alliance. So those two cases are kind of very different than what happens after that. So Iraq and Afghanistan are sort of large scale counterinsurgency operations, which isn't what I'm talking about in my book. I'm talking about foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare. So in terms of large scale counterinsurgency operations, I mean, I think, Afghanistan, I think, is kind of proven this, is that, and in Iraq around 2014 sort of proved this as well. You can't, President Biden said it as well, if they don't have the will to fight, then it's, what are we doing there? Now, I think in certain circumstances, I think limited term interventions to stop certain things, I think are in the U.S. interest to do. I mean, the only place I can really think of, where a large scale kind of counterinsurgency operation would make sense is kind of in like, God forbid, like in Mexico or, somewhere else like that, where it's, it's on our border, it's, presents a kind of a big problem for us. And, we would have to be able to, help there. But in terms of, in Afghanistan, I mean, I kind of, by around 2010 or so, I remember I had, Austin Long come and present a paper at FPRI where his Orbis article, Small is Beautiful, where he just talked about transitioning to a counterterrorism strategy in Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan became a problem because it was kind of the buttress to Iraq. This is the good war. This is why, after 9/11, we told the Taliban, give us bin Laden, and we'll leave you alone, and they refused to do so. One of the big historical what ifs is, what happens if we kill bin Laden or Zawahiri at Tora Bora? We dropped 700,000 pounds worth of ordnance there. But then, for many bureaucratic reasons, we couldn't or wouldn't block the border. It would have been very difficult, especially since bin Laden knew that terrain, in and out since the 1980s. But, had we killed bin Laden and Zawahiri, or even just bin Laden probably in 2001, December 2001, a strong case could be made that, okay, this is a punitive expedition. We got the guy, and, we did this with 300 guys and some airplanes, a lot of airplanes and a lot of ordnance. But you could have made an argument then. I've kind of jokingly said, we could have done like a 3 obelisk policy, build an obelisk in Mazar-e Sharif, build an obelisk in Kandahar, and build one in Kabul, and say, we did this with 300 guys, and we helped your Northern Alliance. Don't make us come back. I think a lot of issues pushed us to kind of half-heartedly engage further in Afghanistan. A lot of other issues kind of to get wider support for the global war on terrorism and for Iraq, frankly. There's a lot of mission creep there. It became about, humanitarian concerns, the plight of women, and all these things are, perfectly understandable and great ideals to fight for. But on the ground, it just became very difficult to do.
Well, I'm glad you drew that distinction between large-scale counterinsurgency and the kind of small-scale irregular conflicts that you talk about in the book, because I wanted to ask, what keeps a small-scale conflict small, or at least based on the examples that we have? What is the difference between the places where the United States engaged in small-scale conflict and was able to keep it small, and those where it eventually became a larger commitment? This is the quagmire problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, the quagmire problem really comes about. I think Vietnam really kind of cemented that in a lot of people's minds. So, in kind of the mythology of the El Salvador campaign, originally in 1980, when the Carter administration first decides to give aid to El Salvador, the regime in San Salvador, to stop a kind of massive offensive after Nicaragua becomes a communist regime under the Sandinistas. The 3rd Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group down in the Canal Zone at the time were told, come up with a plan. And they came up with a plan that said, we're going to send in 55 advisors to work with the El Salvadoran Armed Forces, the ESAF. And then we'll have a follow-on of 250 advisors that will come later. And they say, okay, we're going to do the 55, but you can't have the 250. They wanted to put advisors down to company level in the El Salvadoran Armed Forces. But there was a lot of math, accounting tricks that were at play there. So the 55 didn't include certain types of people. If there were ODAs, Operational Detachment Alphas from 7th Group that rotated into the country, if they were in and out within 2 weeks, they didn't count on the 55 level. Didn't count if we took ESAF units out of the country, like we trained some at Fort Bragg, some in Venezuela and other places. Those didn't count against the limit. But at the same time, it was a small number of people on the ground.
Right. And
Colonel John Wagelstein, who taught at Newport for a long time, he talks about in some of the oral history stuff about talking to his counterpart in the Ministry of Defense in El Salvador and saying, I can get my guys on a plane today If you don't want to do what we're planning on doing, that's fine. But this isn't evacuating Saigon. We'll be on a C-130 and out of here by the end of the day if you're not going to listen to us. And that had a lot of credibility with the ESAF, because in all of these, there's another issue in all these kind of counterinsurgency environments. We're assisting them fighting in their counterinsurgency campaign. Colonel Dave Maxwell retired, makes a big thing. The U.S. can't really be the counterinsurgents unless we're battling an insurgency here in the U.S. We're assisting the other states with their problems of insurgency, criminality, etc. So it's
So then related to that, so the way you describe the situation in El Salvador, that makes a lot of sense, but it obviously took specific political attention and guidance coming down from the DoD, down through from the civilian commanders, civilian responsible people as well, who said, we are not going to do, we're not going to go beyond this limit, even if we have to do a little bit of juggling with the numbers. At least that is a clear commitment. Do we have any other examples of small conflicts where the command and control at the top was firm enough in enforcing limits that allowed for that kept a mission from growing, and also led to success?
I think in the Philippines as well, it was a pretty small commitment there.
This is in the last 15, 20 years, right?
This is 2001 to 2015. Where we had a long history of working with the armed forces of the Philippines, but we had strict limits of the number of personnel that were on the ground and what they could do. Like in El Salvador as well, there are all sorts of rules in place where you were only supposed to go within 3 miles with 5 kilometers of the base that you were working on. You weren't ever allowed to, although people played fast and loose with this somewhat. You were never supposed to be involved in combat operations with your counterparts. So in the Philippines, they did things like that as well, where fighting in Mindanao, they were embedded with headquarters, but not at squads on patrol kind of levels, and also there. The country team there worked properly. And so the ambassador was informed about everything, and they were doing things there as well. Same thing in El Salvador as well. But this also becomes a problem, though, because there are different. Like I also do an example of Operation Enduring Freedom, Trans-Sahara, where you're dealing with a number of different countries. Different capabilities of the embassies there, different personalities of ambassadors there, and that causes problems, particularly when you're dealing with counterterrorism, because we have our tier 1 national mission force units that do things as well, and that comes into play in certain places in North Africa where they're doing operations without the knowledge of the ambassador, and then causing issues down the road.
Right.
But so I think it's definitely easier when you're dealing with one country or a part of one country than it is dealing with kind of a larger region, dealing with all the different bureaucratic pieces and personalities.
Well, and you mentioned everybody's favorite. We talk about coin, so we also have to talk about dime. Those 4 instruments of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. We've talked about military. We've talked about diplomatic. A lot depends on the quality of the country team. Let's talk about information policy as well here, the information instrument of power. Jim Thompson asked this question, and it's worth thinking about in 2 directions. Sort of, how does the United States message its activity towards the place where they are dispatching forces for this small conflict? But also, what kind of information instrument of power does the military use, should the United States government use, for the American public to understand both the purpose and the limits of a small scale operation? Because one could see the argument from the American public that would say, well, if we're going to keep it this small, maybe we don't need to do it at all. And a frustration that would come with a small scale operation that takes a long time. So how should, and this based on the examples in your book, but also your thinking on this subject, how should the American public, or how should the American military manage the information space? Like, is it better when people just aren't paying attention? I don't think there's a lot of front page stories about activities in the Philippines, and that allows that to go on, as opposed to when there's an attack that goes wrong in Niger, and 4 special forces are killed, U.S. special forces are killed. The first reaction of the American public is, wait a second, I didn't know we were fighting in Niger. How should we think about the information space here?
Yeah, so this is really difficult and kind of a complicated issue, but I think in the main, so you have, one of the arguments with, so we went into the Philippines kind of after we were planning on working with them kind of before, and then 9/11 happens, and then we send a team down there to talk about assisting them to fight Abu Sayyaf group, which is kind of an Al-Qaeda linked organization. And at the time, only Afghanistan was going on, and kind of the Philippines was happening, and then kind of North Africa as well, or the Maghreb. So there was a lot more attention then. When Iraq happens, that kind of draws everything to Iraq. And then there's less attention played to these other places. And I think the military prefers that, especially in, special operations forces call themselves, quiet professionals, except for, our brothers and sisters in the Naval service, where it's kind of, I'm joking, I have a tremendous respect for naval special warfare, but their culture is a little bit more flamboyant than Army Special Forces, where it's quiet professionalism. So I think they prefer to they want their counterparts to get the attention. Mm-hmm. You want the Armed Forces of the Philippines to look, or to do a good job, but also to get the attention for their success, which then kind of feeds into success there. So, but then on the other hand, the American people are paying this bill. And we live in a democratic society, and there should be accountability. And the Fourth Estate exists to kind of shine lights onto, the dirty and messy corners of the government. And our whole system of government set up on an adversarial system, where things aren't supposed to be. Nobody's supposed to be able to snap their fingers, and then something automatically happens somewhere. We have. Division of power, which is is by design, and then even within the executive branch, different forces are kind of at cross purposes sometimes, based on their agendas and budgets, etc. So so it's really difficult. But I think in the main, it's better to kind of be more transparent about it, because then when bad things happen, like in the book, there's a great example of Dehofar, which is a British case. Mm-hmm. I use Dehofar because it's still maybe Iraq, but there's not enough information about it yet. It's kind of a good example of a defensive, assertive, small scale intervention. Mm-hmm. And in Dehofar, basically at the time, Sultan Qaboos,
this is in Oman, correct?
This is Oman, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, he's able to basically keep the international press out of there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At the same time, what the British did, when a SAS corporal basically came up with an idea of subsidizing radios, transistor radios, and selling them at the souks around, up in the Jebel, up in the hill country of Dehofar. And they realized that if they just gave the radio to people, they wouldn't care about it. But if they sold it to them, even at a subsidized rate, then they would care for it. And their information policy, even though there's not a lot of international press or scrutiny about the situation, except for there's a lot of agitation propaganda coming out of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which is next door. There's not a lot of international press attention, but what they did was they decided that they were going to tell kind of warts and all truth when they gave news reports, so that when people in the Jebel heard the news, they was like, okay, yeah, that happened. Or when they would hear the radio coming from across the border in Yemen, there would be these outlandish stories and a lot of propaganda. They said that's not what happened there. And I think that credibility of hearing, even if bad things happened, I think on the ground, it helped the information environment, and people became more trusting of Sultan Qaboos and the Omani security forces there in Dehofar, which before that, you can read about it in the book.
And you all should. There you go.
That's
Amazon,
right.
Let's advertise. That's right. You
you
should.
Yeah. There's it's not something I want to punt on, but it's definitely, I think there is a responsibility to report what's happening, unless it's something where people's lives are on the line if something comes out.
Right.
But at the same time, I think in a democracy there needs to be some sunlight on what people in uniform are doing in our names overseas.
Well, and this gets to a question that lurks in the background of this, related to the Quagmire issue, but also and related to current events, is whatever operation, big, small, violent, or high intensity, low intensity, there is the question of strategic patience. In the United States, it is a cliche, which I'm going to indulge in, right? That the American public has a short attention span, and also, and that American politics thinks in terms of short-term gains and losses. And so if we're talking about the potential that we have adversaries who may be engaged in long-term, low-level, low intensity, but still continuous intensity operations, what should or could the leadership of the United States, both the professional military and the civilian political leadership, how should they conceive of how we talk about these kinds of operations to an American public that will go from being uninterested to intensely interested in demanding results very quickly based on crisis or change in events on the ground? So how do you fight these kinds of conflicts, basically, while also helping the public to understand why they are worth continuing to fight?
Yeah. I mean, this is I think this is an issue that's kind of gotten worse over time, I think, because there's so much information out there, and so many, a lot of people are so engaged and focused on different things that there's kind of constantly this, in the information space here and abroad, there's attention on these things. So that makes things difficult. It makes the ability to do things overseas very quietly more difficult, because anybody with a smartphone, or I guess we should just call them phones now, anybody with a phone overseas can record something and send it, upload it pretty fast.
Right.
So it's, elections here, I think, are, one of the issues, how we divvy up our elections, because, a presidential administration is 4 years, and, a maximum of 8, or, 10 if they were the vice president, come into office. But that, I think, constrains things. So I think, we definitely, Steve Metz, one of your colleagues has said it's basically 3 and out. You have basically 3 years to be able to do what you want to do. I think that's more for kind of large scale operations, and that makes sense on a certain level, unless it's a conflict where the survival of the United States is at stake. I think more limited time horizon. I think we fought the Second World War in the U.S. In 4 years.
Right.
So I mean, I think that makes sense. I think on these that's part of the problem for these more limited scale operations.
Right. Because I look and I see that the Russians are engaged in a long-term, low-intensity but intermittently very violent conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah.
For we're going on year 7, right? If I glance at my watch,
Yeah.
and the Russian deployment or involvement in Syria is going on. Gosh, it has to be going on 7 years.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think one of the most dangerous things in any democratic society is when we get to dictator envy. And when leaders think,
Yeah.
well, boy, so-and-so gets to get away with this stuff and nobody challenges him.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that's what makes his regime terrible. Right. So we should be glad. We should be glad that we have questions. But there is the issue of how, because this is where it gets hard, right? Is it's not enough for the military leadership or the political leadership to reach out and pat the American public on the proverbial shoulder and say, honey, you just don't understand how complicated this is and how necessary this is. No, your job in running a government is to explain why it's necessary and to accept consequences and to be honest about what's going on. And you mentioned before that you think that this has gotten harder, not easier. Have we learned anything as within the military, within the American public? You tell a story, you include a lot of examples here. Do you see any progress in understanding about how to talk about these kinds of engagements within a democratic society?
Yeah, so I think so these types of conflicts, I think a lot of them deal with narratives.
Mm-hmm.
So you're constructing a narrative about the government on the ground, et cetera, or our progress there, how we're going to assist. I think Iraq and Afghanistan will make things. I think there'll be some wariness, deservedly. I think moving forward a bit. But I think part of the another reason for doing this book is to look at these smaller scale things and say, this isn't just kind of a one size fits all, or we shouldn't just think about Iraq or Afghanistan. There are other ways to do this, and I think deservedly that these kinds of interventions are going to be, whether we like it or not, are going to be kind of more prevalent moving forward. The information space, I think, is important. I think we need to do a better job. You talked about Russia before. This is another issue here that we haven't really touched on either, is the use of private security contractors overseas as kind of in Russia you have Wagner Group, where we got into our special forces got into a prolonged gunfight in eastern Syria with Wagner Group, which are for all intents and purposes they're kind of a de facto arm of Russia, Russian defense and foreign policy. I think you'll see kind of more of that overseas, where even during kind of the global war on terrorism, you have people that go through contracting bids and see in order to keep a small footprint overseas, we've really leaned heavily on contractors to do a lot of logistics, intelligence, communication support, other things overseas, to keep the number of U.S. service personnel smaller there. And I think that's probably going to be something going on more in the future rather than less. So I think really the key issue is to kind of try to under promise and over deliver where you can.
Well, that might be the way to go. Well, and speaking of under promising and over delivering, or the converse, the role of technology in all this, that technology can create the illusion of control. Richard Millett asks about the reliance on drones and sort of long range surveillance, and also for targeted strikes, right? That it feeds into a fantasy of American intervention at zero personal cost. And how should we understand the role of technology and changes in technology in these kinds of low intensity interventions?
Yeah, I mean, so, basically the United States had air superiority in every conflict from, the Gulf War, or, even before that, and, Panama, to the present, question mark. But there is a big
Right.
proliferation of unmanned aerial systems, and not just kind of, fancy, stealthy, you know, um, fighter, autonomous fighter airplanes, but also smaller, long duration, long loiter time, um, platforms that can conduct strikes overseas by, the smallest of overseas countries, or sub-state actors as well. We've seen them. We've seen them in Iraq. We've seen them in Yemen, etc. So yeah, it's a operational reality. In northern Iraq, ISIS was using them to drop grenades onto Iraqi and U.S. positions, etc. So yeah, part of that I think is kind of offense defense balance, where there's this innovation, and then we'll come up with things to kind of defeat it, until you get to the situation where you introduce the the snakes, and then you have to get rid of the snakes, and then you have to get rid of the thing that got rid of the snakes. The problem there, the cobra to the tiger.
To the tiger. That's right. Yeah.
Issue. So yeah, those will be increasingly at lower levels, kind of operational realities.
Right.
Moving forward.
One last question moving forward, and it's a big one, but I'm going to give you 2 big minutes to answer it, and it is related to this question from Rijels Lenya, who basically says, right, the United States hasn't really, we haven't exactly been on a winning streak since 1999, which might be since Kosovo, which was, I guess. Should the United States be thinking about ways to engage its hard power, or should the United States be wondering whether hard power engagements have created such diminishing returns that we should be looking for other ways to engage with the international community?
Yeah. I mean, I think several people brought up. I think one thing to be much more humble about what we can do abroad. We need some humility for things that we do abroad. Another thing is we have to get past what I talk about in the book, and my friend Frank Hoffman came up with this, is the one-armed cyclops problem that we have. And the one-armed cyclops is basically, we have this one eye that's looking for threats. Then we have one like really super developed arm that we use to knock out threats, and then everything else is kind of left to not atrophy, but it's just not the same type of capability. And we definitely need to work to because if you talk to the military, in Iraq or Afghanistan, they always wanted to say, well, when is the interagency going to show up? When is the interagency going to show up? But this, I'm going to show my Gen X side here and talk about, there was a South Park episode where Stan goes and gets audited by Scientologists, and they say, well, to unlock more potential, you have to pay for these audits in the future. So he goes home to his dad and says, Dad, I need money to go do this thing. He said, well, don't you have money in the bank? He goes, yeah, but that's my money. This is kind of the DoD response to when they want the interagency to show up, and it's like, well, if you just $1 billion here and $1 billion there,
right?
What's the harm? But in terms of budgets, other interagency partners need to kind of have more capabilities, whether it's AID, Agency for International Development, the State Department, the Drug Enforcement Administration, other things that are all kind of vital actors overseas. It's not just kind of the DoD game, or the intelligence community. So I think hard power we need to be humble about. I think there are definitely times when we need to flex it, but at the same time, I think because of the strategic environment, because of the type of competition that we're facing right now. I think that I think to say, well, we haven't done this well means that we shouldn't do it, I think is the wrong answer. I think it emboldens people. Bruce Hoffman talked about 1975 or so at Fort Bragg. They came and they got all the stuff about counterinsurgency and they took it away and destroyed it. We can't allow that to happen again, because otherwise we're just going to be, we're going to have to learn everything on the fly again. And that's going to, cost the lives of, men and women in uniform and not in uniform overseas who have to kind of relearn all these things. So we have to be mindful and careful and protective of our blood and treasure. At the same time, we also have to look at things realistically and understand that, we can't just be, we can't be like the other hobbits in the Shire, not worrying about what's happening overseas. Sometimes maybe you need to send, 4 good hobbits abroad to kind of pitch in.
I like that range of cultural references there, from South Park to Tolkien, and your call to be learned and realistic.
And one conversation with Ron Granieri where I didn't bring up Jack Kemp, Buffalo 66, or Thurman Thomas or Jim Kelly. Or
that'll be next time. We'll have to talk about that next time.
Yeah.
But for today, unfortunately, we have used up our entire hour in conversation. Thank you so much, Mike Noonan.
Thank you so much, Ron.
The book, Irregular Soldiers and Rebellious States, is available from Rowman and Littlefield at your bookstores now. Please check it out if you want to be learned about these kinds of operations. Thanks, Mike Noonan. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Our conversation today is over. We appreciate your questions. We're sorry if we couldn't get to all of them, but we're glad for your engagement. FPRI would like to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support for this program, and all of you for joining us here on Zoom or watching us right now on YouTube. But today's conversation is just the beginning of all the things we do at FPRI. The world goes on, and we will always be here to discuss it. If you've enjoyed our discussion today, tell a friend and bring a friend next time when we gather to analyze our complex world, and consider becoming a member or partner to support the work that we do at FPRI. But to keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose, other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I am Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.